All right. Hi, all. Thank you for joining us today for Iran 1400's Spotlighting an Author event. Today, we will be discussing Alex Vatanka's The Battle of the Ayatollahs in Iran, the United States Foreign Policy and Political Rivalry since 1979. Thanks for joining us. As some of you may already know, the goal of the Iran 1400 project is to encourage productive conversations about Iran by looking at the evolution of ideas and institutions within the country during the last century. We are certain that today's discussion will be a valuable resource in that mission. A quick word from our advisory board. Alex Vatanka, on behalf of the advisory board and the team at Iran 1400 project, we thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. We are honored to have you with us to share your research and insights on the Iranian experience. Welcome. And now to introduce our guest. Alex Vatanka is the founding director of the Iran program at the Middle East Institute. He specializes in Middle Eastern regional security affairs with a particular focus on Iran. He was formerly a senior analyst at Jane's Information Group in London. Alex is also a senior fellow in Middle East Studies at the U.S. Air Force Special Operations School at Hurlburt Field and teaches as an adjunct professor at DISAS at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He has testified before the U.S. Congress and lectured widely for both governmental and commercial audiences, including the U.S. Departments of State and Defense, U.S. intelligence agencies, and a list of international corporations. Born in Tehran, he holds a BA in political science and an MA in international relations. He is also the author of Iran and Pakistan, Security, Diplomacy, and American Influence. Now, for today's event, we will listen to Alex Vatanka discuss his book for 20 to 30 minutes, and this will be followed by a Q&A that will last for the rest of the hour. And if you would like to submit a question, you can do so in the Zoom Q&A, or you can email your question to media@iran1400.org. Now we have a quick teaser before we begin. Whenever you're ready.
Great. Thank you so much, Sydney. Thank you for that warm introduction, and thanks to everyone at Project Iran 1400 for inviting me. I very much look forward to the few minutes we have here today. Look, I'm going to share some slides in a minute, but before we do that, let me just lay the ground in terms of why I decided to write this book. Lots of books have been written on Iranian foreign policy over the years. There are so many excellent academics from Iran, from around the world that have worked on this topic. So you could make the argument that this is not exactly a topic that hasn't been worked on before. What I wanted to do, as someone who has born, as you said, born in Iran, essentially my life has been my life became what it is because of the revolution of 1979. I probably would not be sitting here in Virginia today had that revolution not happened. And I'm not alone in that. There are millions of Iranians around the world who had to leave their homeland because of that revolution. So I saw it as a young person when it happened. And then professionally, I ended up covering Iran Since year 2001, I began in London doing so, and then later on moved to the United States. So I know the topic quite well, but I also knew there was maybe perhaps a space in the market for a different approach to the topic. And that idea came to me when I first started teaching for the US, different branches of the United States military, and in places like State Department. We all know there hasn't been an American presence, official presence in Iran pretty much since 1979 and the hostage crisis in November of that year. But we still have plenty of Americans interested in that country. So what I wanted to do was to write a book that was designed for non-practitioners, non-experts on Iran, but to sort of tell them the key turning points and how policy was made since 79. And I've focused on foreign policy because that is probably of most interest to non-Iranians. So, to cover foreign policy of 40 years in a country like Iran that has been involved in so many arenas over the years is not necessarily an easy task. And I thought to myself, you have to be very careful and selective. And that's what I did in terms of choosing the topics for the book. So, key focus of the book throughout from 79 onwards to pretty much present day. The book was published in 22. So it pretty much, 21, it pretty much comes all the way to present day. And the topics that I stayed focused on throughout are, for example, US-Iran relations, Iran's turbulent relations with the Arab world. And I say this today on a day where we've just learned just a few hours ago, those of us living in Washington area, Eastern time, that Iran and Saudi Arabia have decided to normalize relations after 7 years break. The issue of Saudi Arabia is in the book. It's a topic that, it plays a pretty prominent role in Iranian, certainly regional policy since 1979. I showcase throughout the book in terms of opportunities also that existed for this Islamist system in Tehran when it had the opportunity to go in a different direction, frankly, to change course, to perhaps put the revolutionary rhetoric aside and start something new, and what those opportunities were, where those moments were, and why. By and large, the regime, certainly since Ali Khamenei became supreme leader in '89, has decided not to take those opportunities. And there are also more relevant, for today's world, relevant sort of focus in the book, namely Iran's focus on Russia and China. I sort of trace the roots of Ali Khamenei's Look East doctrine that is so prominent, and maybe today you could make the argument, well, is providing results. Look, the Chinese just helped Khamenei broker a potential peace deal with the Saudis, but that remains to be seen. But overall, the book is focused on personalities. I mean, there are, as I said, plenty of books on Iranian foreign policy. Some look at institutions, some look at informal networks. There are lots of different approaches to the study of Iranian foreign policy. I wanted to focus on personalities because there's a story to tell. Anyone can relate to a good story, and that's what this book is attempting to do. And it focuses on two individuals that have been probably more significant in shaping Iranian foreign policy for the last almost half a century than anybody else. One is obviously the current Iranian supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and the other one is the man who made him supreme leader, in my estimation, Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, who passed away in 2017. And but nonetheless, while he was alive, he was a formidable political force, not so much at the end of his life, but he was somebody that really was one of the architects in many ways of what this system became. And he was also an architect who knew, certainly by the end of his life, that they had gotten it wrong and that it was time to change course. But by the time he admitted to that reality, it was too late, and he passed away. And in the book, I do point out that his death is still treated with many questions, and some would say his death was suspicious. Certainly members of the Rafsanjani family have repeatedly made the point that his death in that upscale swimming pool where the Revolutionary Guards security detail that was supposed to look after him conveniently weren't nearby when he drowned. So it's a book that focuses on not just individuals, but key individuals and key rivalries. So I look at the issue of this rivalry where Rafsanjani wanted to go and where Khamenei decided to stay the course and remain a revolutionary state, and the price that the nation of Iran has had to pay for it. Sydney, if you don't mind, maybe we should start with the slides. I'll go through these slides pretty fast. You are in control of the slides. Thanks for bringing them up. Yeah, if we could go to the next slide, please. And I just really have just some photos to share to set the stage so we can get to our Q&A, which I look forward to the most. Here's a picture of the Shah of Iran. Look, the fact is, from 1941 to 1979, Iran is arguably in many ways America's biggest ally in the Middle East, certainly in terms of size and what it could bring to the table. And the Shah, a secular man, a secular monarch, certainly not a Democrat, but somebody who loved his country, a good friend of the United States, I would argue, invested heavily in that relationship and considered the United States a strategic ally. That is not the focus of this book. But I think to really understand where we are today, some 44 years after the Iranian Revolution, you need to have a sense of what the Shah's calculations were, why he was opposed to the people who toppled him in 1979. And I think the question really that you have to also ask yourself is to undo almost 40 years of close relationship between the United States and Iran. To undo that was not going to be an easy task if you had asked people back in 79. The relations were so close on so many different levels that it was almost not an impossible, but certainly a very difficult task. And yet, Khomeini or Khomeinists, the circle of people that came with him to power, managed to do it, managed to undo that close relationship fairly quickly. And I think the one obviously incident that made that happen is the 4th of November 1979 decision by supporters of Khomeini to storm the US embassy, which led to the hostage crisis, which is an episode that in many ways is still alive. Hostages came home a long time ago, but the sort of implications, the consequences of that hostage taking is still something that is, I think, it's certainly my mind, unresolved or unsettled issue. But I just wanted to set the stage and say that the one key issue that came out for me in terms of the calculations that the Islamists made, Khomeinists made, to take the embassy was foreign policy related as a secondary issue. It was very much a decision rooted in domestic power competition. Again, this is something that I sort of lay out by some facts and saying how Khomeini was sold on this idea principally by the left, not his inner circle. And I think that's really interesting because it shows you something about when we ask the question today, what drives Iranian foreign policy? Oftentimes we like to sort of look at it in terms of Islamism, the ideological framework that is a driver. But I think the earliest example we have of the most consequential decision that Khomeini and his people made back then, as I said, something that still needs to be settled finally, was not ideological, was certainly not something that was principally ideological. It was principally rooted in the fact that one, in this case, Khomeini and his people looked to this issue as a way of consolidating power and depriving the political left that they were rivals of something that they represented, i.e. anti-Americanism. If we could go to the next slide, please, Sydney. So here we have a picture of Khomeini. Look, again, I don't discuss the man Khomeini in this book as much. I discuss his role in those key foreign policy moments that I described before. But he certainly was not a man who said Iran was going to be an isolated country once he took over in '79. That was not a pledge. That was not a promise he and his supporters made. But it is essentially what Iran became. And you can ask the question: what were the reasons why Khomeini and Khomeinists ended up on this path? And as part of the book research, I ended up traveling to the country of Pakistan, because Pakistan was one of the first countries that was trying to be a mediator between Iran and the rest of the world. And when I went to Pakistan and interviewed a number of former diplomats and looked at the archives, one of the things that stood out for me was this Pakistani notion that the Iranian revolutionaries they saw around Khomeini when they arrived to Tehran in '79 were, and I just basically want to describe to you the words I heard, had a very poor understanding of international relations, were naive in terms of what they could achieve, were naive in terms of what they could do vis-a-vis the United States, had this romantic idea that, you know, the global order needed to be shaken up, but had no sense of what it meant in practice and what they could do to bring it about, because they hadn't really even tried to open up the toolbox to see what tools they had at their disposal to do what they're setting to do. So that was one thing. And the other thing that, you know, we all know and exists to this day is from day one, you've had a pretty intense internal regime competition in terms of shaping foreign policy. In the 1980s, it's very much a free-for-all moment where you have, you know, different factions going in different directions, having different partners on the, you know, international landscape out there, pursuing different objectives. Khomeini kept this, and by the way, I mean, again, in the book, you have plenty of examples of that. One just jumped at me, Prime Minister Mir Hossein Mousavi, who today is under house arrest because he was the leader of the Green Opposition Movement in 2009. But in the 1980s, he was very much a Khomeini loyalist and someone who obviously was prime minister. And he, you know, repeatedly complained that there were things happening in the realm of foreign policy that he had no knowledge about. So the question then is, well, if the prime minister of the land doesn't know what's going on, who is really calling the shots? And that's what I call it free for all. You had different individuals, different factions in the system pursuing different objectives. While Khomeini is alive up till 1989, he keeps this sort of anarchy in some order. It doesn't spill out. You don't have, you know, shootings in the streets. There's no sign of the regime fracturing beyond the point of redemption. But the lesson also from this period and the legacy that Khomeini leaves behind is the following. He keeps the system one way or another in place, the policy-making process, this anarchy that I just described. But he never really controls it. He's never the statesman who shapes policy-making. He is one individual who's got absolute power, about 20 or so people in his office, and whoever had his ear, whoever could go in and talk to him, might actually get him to decide on a given issue this way or the other way, which is quite interesting because it puts so much power in the hands of the supreme leader, not necessarily something that's laid out in the constitution of the Islamic Republic, but this is what happens in reality. And this is what Khamenei, the current supreme leader, likes, and he cherishes that sort of power. And since he became supreme leader in 1989, he's decided that sharing that kind of influence over policymaking, if it can be avoided, he'd rather not share. And that resulted in conflicts with successive presidents, something I will get to down the slides as we go forward. Various presidents have complained that they don't have this sort of ability to shape foreign policy as they should as elected officials. Now, again, Iranian elections, whether free or not, whether it's significant or not, whole different story. If anybody has questions about it, I'd love to get into it. But the point I'm trying to make is the legacy of the 1980s in the shape how Khomeini, the first founder of the Islamic Republic, how he kind of oversaw foreign policy making, what he did and what he did not do, and how Khamenei, the current supreme leader, learned the lessons and inherited that legacy, and then spent the last 34 years basically dominating more and more, gradually with time, the decision-making process is in many ways why we are where we are when we often look at Iranian indecision, a lack of clarity. We can talk about the nuclear issue. We can talk about Iran's relations with the neighborhood. We can talk about all sorts of issues. And we sort of ask ourselves, well, how come they're not moving? How come Iran's nuclear program has gone on for 20 years now, since 2003, when it was sort of first began to be negotiated with the West? 20 years, a long time. Where does this indecision come from? And you get personalities matter. And in this case, I think the legacy of Khamenei and what he passed on to Khamenei is something that people ought to take into account. If we could go to the next slide, I'm speaking way more than I should. I haven't even moved down the slides. Very quickly on this issue, one of the key attributes I think you can put at the door of the Khomeinis from their behavior early on is this lack of ability to compromise. This is a group of people, and that is true to this day as you look at the protest movement in Iran. Compromise is not something they like to do. It's a bad word for them. It's a sign of weakness. They think the Shah tried to compromise, and that resulted in his downfall. So they want to go the opposite direction. They believe that you stay in power by demonstrating resolve, force, arrest, execution if necessary, and that's what they're doing right now. And you saw this lack of compromising first at home. The picture we're looking at here is spring of 1979, when they started hinting at the forced hijab, the forced veil. And so the first big uncompromising decision by the Khomeinis is actually domestic policy related, not foreign policy. It happened 6 or so months before they're taking over the U.S. Embassy. But again, what it has in common with taking over the U.S. Embassy is this uncompromising position, adopting a very uncompromising stance. They did that in, as I said, first with the issue of women's role and place in society. Then they did that in the realm of foreign policy by trying to, as they would put it, kick the United States out of Iran. And if we could go to the next slide, please. This one here, I'm just two other topics that throughout the book I try and sort of unpack is this obsession with Israel. I touch on how Khomeini really didn't know much about the issue of Israel. If you go back and look at Khomeini's book from the certainly 50s, or even if you want to go back to the 40s, even though the State of Israel wasn't created then, he does not have a position as such on the State of Israel. I think the great influence from the left, which is anti-Israel, on Khomeini is quite glaring. It's really interesting how it comes about almost not accidental, but it wasn't a core issue for Islamist Khomeini. And look at it today. Look at where we are today on Khamenei's position on Israel. For him, there's nothing more important than the sort of hostility he has towards Israel. But in the book, I show how this sort of came actually through the left, and wasn't something the cleric themselves had thought about that deeply. The issue of the United States, you could argue the same thing happens. Someone like Khamenei is not among the most vocal anti-American voices out there. In fact, in the book, I show how when the November siege of the U.S. Or seizure of the diplomats take place in November of '79, Khamenei and Rafsanjani, both of them happened to be on pilgrimage in Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And their first reaction when they find out what had happened is, are you people mad? What are you doing? This is picking up a fight we can't afford. We're not going to win this one. They go back to Tehran and they figure this actually could be what later was labeled the second revolution. the picking up a fight with the Americans is an excellent way of depriving the left, the anti-American left, from a prized policy stance that the left had. So again, going back to the issue of how domestic power politics ends up shaping some consequential foreign policy decisions that this regime has taken. If we could go to the next slide, please. So from 1979, you could say, to by 81, 82, certainly most of the anti-Shah factions that were not Islamist have been destroyed by the clergy. And the clergy makes a very important decision, which frankly has worked for them, for good or bad. We can discuss why good, why bad, but they made a pact with the Revolutionary Guards, an entity they created themselves in 79 as a defender of the political clergy. So the likes of Khamenei and Rafsanjani are like-minded in many ways. There are moments of rivalry. Again, in the book, I show the archives, evidence of Rafsanjani and Khamenei, even as early as 83, 84, competing for loyalists in the ranks of the regime. So the competition is there. But overall, the two men are like-minded. They don't like the left. They don't like the secular forces. So they want this system to reflect the views of the political clergy, a class they come from. But by the time, and by the way, Rafsanjani and Khamenei oftentimes stood against some of the more reckless elements within the regime. So one example that jumps again at me is the decision to reject any calls to side with Saddam Hussein when Saddam invaded Kuwait, and the Western world, of the free world, wanted to remove Saddam out of Kuwait. There were folks actually in the Iranian regime who wanted to side with Saddam against the US. And it was the likes of Rafsanjani and Khamenei who joined forces and said, this is reckless, we should stay out of this fight. Let's move on very fast, Sydney, and I have to apologize. I'm speaking a lot more than I had planned to do, but I will go through the next few slides fast. When Khomeini dies in 1989, Rafsanjani makes a biggest probably miscalculation in his life. He looks at his friend Ali Khamenei and he says, why don't we make him the supreme leader? That becomes a symbolic position. He will sort of deal with religious matters, and I, Rafsanjani, will have the real power, executive power. I can run the place the way I like. I can turn around and focus on reconstruction. This is after the Iran-Iraq war, and that might just get us some legitimacy with the Iranian public. That was Rafsanjani's vision. What happens, of course, is very different because, yes, for a few years early on in the 1990s, Rafsanjani can send signals to the West. I mean, there are all sorts of moments of trying to find win-win formula to coexist, if you will, with the United States. For example, the case of Iran helping to free hostages in Lebanon held by pro-Iranian groups. The Iranians wanted some sanctions lifted. They wanted some of the frozen cash returned to them. So there were efforts like that going on early 1990s, all pretty much led by Rafsanjani. And while Khamenei then was already supreme leader, he hadn't consolidated. So he wasn't pushing back much. That obviously changes years later. And by the late 1990s, Khamenei is very much, so much more confident that he stands up, and he does object to some of these efforts by Rafsanjani and other so-called moderates in the regime who wanted to find ways to sort of turn the page and start a new chapter with the Western world. And let me just say this thing, because this is, I think, key for the history of the Islamic Republic, and it's key very much today and going forward. Khamenei never looked at this issue in terms of ideology, and I don't think he does today. The issue of the United States for him is not that he's offended personally if the US embassy reopens in downtown Tehran. The British embassy is there, the German embassies there, all sorts of embassies are there. Why would it matter to him? Well, it matters to him because Khamenei's worldview, and you can go to his website and you can read all this in various languages that publishes his lines of thinking. He believes any kind of compromise with the Americans, which is why I'm skeptical of where we're going in terms of US-Iran relations. any kind of compromise is going to come at his expense, not necessarily the regime expense, but the supreme leader's expense, because he, for whatever reason, thinks that the American side considers the Islamic Republic maybe as something that can be reformed, but surely the office of the supreme leader is something that needs to, if not abolished, significantly weakened. And from his very selfish point of view, that's not something he wants to see. I think, that's why, if we could go to the next slide, please. That's why repeatedly over the years, he stopped folks like Muhammad Khatami, who came up and coined the phrase dialogue of civilization, from actually having direct lines of communication with the Americans. He didn't trust the likes of Khatami. And if we could go to the next slide, he didn't even trust individual like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who was basically made president, if you will, in many ways. He could not have been made president without the support of Khamenei and his circle. So even Ahmadinejad, once in his second term, decided he wanted to break free from Khamenei and have an independent foreign policy of his own. Khamenei put the brakes on him. Again, going back to the point of personalities, in this case, Khamenei, and his very narrow sets of interest, in this case, making sure the office of the supreme leader remains as powerful as possible. So he is sidelined, whether it's a reformist president, Khatami, whether it's a hardliner, populist like Ahmadinejad. He has sidelined presidents who've come and wanted to go in a different direction than his wishes. In the process, what Khamenei has done, for example, with the allowing someone like Ahmadinejad to become president, they have hollowed out the system from competent bureaucrats. So over the years, competency, you could argue that at some point in the 80s, there were competent bureaucrats working in the Islamic Republic. Today, those competent forces are all marginalized, or if not fired, retired. So when you look at Iran today, anybody who's got a senior position, it's not because of competence, because of loyalty to Khamenei, the man. And I think that is something that is really hurting Iranian national interest. If we could go to the next slide, please. I am over by 5 minutes. Here we have the same with Rouhani. The only reason Khamenei allowed someone like Hassan Rouhani, by the way, someone who Khamenei knows quite well, going back to the 70s, they were all part of the pro-Khomeini faction. But again, they also went separate ways over the years. Khamenei did not let Hassan Rouhani become president in 2013 because he shared his vision, but he did so out of necessity. Again, in the book, I show how Khamenei is surprised by the strength of the sanctions that the US puts on Iran from 2010, 11, but 12, it's really hitting the Iranian economy. This surprises Khamenei. He had not calculated that kind of American clout and ability to hurt the Iranian economy single-handedly. So when that happens, the sanctions are hurting. I think that's when Khamenei decides that perhaps they need to find a figure inside the regime in the shape of a president that might be able to have some kind of a conversation with the Americans that might get the sanctions lifted. And that's how we ended up with the 2015 nuclear deal. But what Khamenei does not want to do is for the nuclear deal to become something bigger. So very early on, once the nuclear deal is signed, he's very clear about it. Do not talk to the Americans about anything else. Don't talk about the region, what Iran is doing in places like Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. Do not talk about it. And he comes up with this phrase that the Americans only want concession. If they ask you for a concession today, they want another concession tomorrow, and they're not going to finish asking for concessions till there is no Islamic Republic anymore. That is his worldview. Again, why I'm cynical whether Iran and the United States can actually find a diplomatic breakthrough. They might find another nuclear deal that they can live with, both of them, in terms of putting Iran's nuclear program, certainly contain it. But in the big picture, in terms of what it really requires, as far as a dialogue is concerned, to say that Iran and US have moved on, I'm not sure if Khamenei is ready. And again, I show through examples in the book why he has decided to go in a different direction. He prefers Iran's isolation and finding alternative solutions to that isolation. For example, supporting proxy groups in the region, which in Khamenei's way of thinking is helping Iran break its isolation. But in reality, Iran's support for the proxy groups is nothing but a drain on Iranian coffers. It's not giving Iranian economy a boost. It might give Iran some hard power in places in the region. Certainly, there are examples like Hezbollah in Lebanon that does give Iran an ability to project power. But again, it's not serving immediate Iranian national interest. I think, certainly not if you think that the most important national interest right now is to do some nation building, to fix their economy. And if we could go to the next slide. This is the second last slide. This is why Khamenei has turned to the likes of Vladimir Putin and the Chinese Communist Party as ways for him not to have to compromise with the Americans. So we all know Russia, China, and the Islamic Republic of Iran in terms of ideology have really nothing in common except one thing, anti-Americanism. And that is even limited, certainly in the case of China. But that's enough. That's enough for this Iranian regime to come up with this idea of a new doctrine called Look East, and that China and Russia will help Iran survive the sanctions, survive the isolation that the Western world is trying to put on Iran. And again, I can't tell you now that this is a fundamentally wrong assumption, or it's not going to happen. It might happen. We've certainly seen Russian-Iranian relations deepen significantly since the Ukraine war in the last year, but it's coming at a very high price. So this path that Khamenei has chosen not to talk to the United States is coming at a very high price tag. And I think that can only, in his mind, be justified because he's putting himself first. He's putting the powers of the supreme leader first, and the national interest of Iran is in his calculation certainly secondary. And then the last one, and I'll stop here. Sydney, you can take over a minute. Is this pact that I described earlier before, the pact that they made in '79 between the clerics, Khamenei's of this world, and the Revolutionary Guards, the men you see in dark green uniform here. This pact is pretty much still alive today. But if you listen to some of the debate in Iran today with the protest movement going on, you have to wonder if these senior members of the Revolutionary Guards and others in the regime haven't come to the conclusion that Khamenei's obsession with controlling Iranian foreign policy, making sure the issue of the differences with the Americans are not resolved, if that's worth a fight going forward. And I think there are signs that more and more people are genuinely offering the thinking that it's just unsustainable, that this fight with the United States, when you look at it over the last 44 years, has cost Iran so much, and the return, in terms of national interest, has been minimal. It might have been a wonderful scenario for the likes of Ali Khamenei, because that is the way he sees himself being protected by keeping the Americans out. But it's not doing Iran, the nation, much good. And that's the challenge for the leadership in the Islamic Republic as they ponder over the post-Khamenei era. The 83-year-old Khamenei will eventually at some point leave this world. If there is an Islamic Republic in place by then, this issue of what to do with the United States is a moment for them to make a decision. They can double down. They can recommit to what they did in November of 1979, or they can fundamentally agree, which is something many people in the regime have agreed over the years, which is to say that was a mistake. November of 1979 was an unnecessary event. It hasn't served Iran, and they wish it hadn't happened. But there you have it, Sydney. You can now end the slideshow. I'm back, ready for your questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. Really appreciate you being here with us today. Those in the audience, please send in your questions. You can do so through the Zoom Q&A, and we'll give Alex a tiny break as I give y'all some announcements. First, we have a short video that explains a unique opportunity for those who are interested in keeping up with Iran.
Do you find understanding what's going on in Iran below the surface of headlines and sensational news challenging? Policy advisors, foreign policy experts, government and business leaders, and strategic communication specialists rely on data to analyze possibilities and make effective decisions. Sotos Light brings noise-free curated data plus summarization of debates and sentiment analytics to your fingertips at the speed of media in English and Farsi. Daily Snapshot identifies the debates and offers you curated and labeled snapshots related to dozens of main issues of interest to the U.S. national security and the international community from Iranian media outlets and social media. This feature saves you time to quickly identify what's been debated around the topics of interest, be it Iran's nuclear program, regional footprint, military reach, or sanctions. Discourse AI eliminates the time-consuming process of news gathering. It provides a compilation of the articles written on the issue or, even better, a summarization of related segments of those articles for your quick review. What do Iranian people think? Do you rely on polls, surveys, or limited publicly available data? Opinion Analytics utilizes our unique methodology and measures shifts in the opinion of Iranian pundits as they discuss issues in their media outlets and social media. Save time and gain more insight with noise-free and time series curated data from digital media and social media. High accuracy and relevancy to key issues of importance to national security interests. Summaries of debates around key issues. Dynamic attitude measurements and trends.
And if y'all are interested in learning more about that, we will have an email following up with more information if you are interested. As well, further in Iran 1400 events, we are planning on hosting a Woman Life Freedom event in Farsi. Stay tuned for more information about that. Now, let's get into the questions. So, the first question I'd like to start with, Alex, how were other factions able to exploit the rivalry between Khamenei and Rafsanjani to further their own interests?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure if anything comes to my mind in terms of the 1980s. Certainly, the sort of left, not even left, even the sort of liberal Islamists like Bani Sads and so on, and Mujahideen Khalq later on, I don't see any evidence of any of those groups having been able to use the rivalry between Khamenei and Rafsanjani to their own advantage. But I have to say, again, I think the evidence of the rivalry between Khamenei and Rafsanjani doesn't happen till later on, when the sort of worst political instability in post-Islamic Republic has already kind of subsided. It happens by more like mid-1980s as opposed to early 1980s. So I don't see much of evidence of that in the 1980s period. I think you can make the argument that the Khamenei-Rafsanjani relationship, as it becomes more contentious going forward, does present an opportunity for political groups inside the regime that have a different view than Khamenei to sort of see if they can utilize that. And they, to some extent, they do, because, and I say it for this reason, Rafsanjani, by the end of his life, had kind of transformed himself as somebody who was more disliked at some point in his life than Khamenei was, to potentially being the leader of, if you will, the sort of reform movement. The idea that Rafsanjani died being even conceived of someone who could be the leader of the reform movement. If you had said that 10 years before he died, people would have said, no way. But that's basically where he was by end of early 2017, January 2017, when he died. Let me stop there, Sydney.
It's really interesting. Thank you. We do have some questions from the audience coming in. Thanks for a great talk and analysis. Did the Soviet Union exercise any influence over relations with the US or the lack of them, the taking of the US embassy, or was anti-Americanism related to the coup of 1953?
Wonderful question, big question. Both of them are pretty big. Let me take the Soviet role first. I think that's an unsettled issue to this day. I think, I've seen American, declassified American cables from State Department, if I'm not mistaken. It could have been from the CIA. To be honest, I'm not sure which source it was, but not to say that they didn't have any evidence to suggest that the Soviets had encouraged the takeover of the US Embassy of November 79. What we do obviously know is that the Soviets were not exactly an innocent bystander in all of this. To turn Iran from being a country that had been a friend of the United States from 1941 to 79, to turn this country around, to even make it independent or neutral, if you will. I shouldn't have said independent, I should have said neutral, because Iran was independent of the Shah, but it wasn't necessarily neutral during the Cold War context, would have been a win for Moscow, for the Soviets. In the book, I have a few pages on how one member of Khomeini's revolutionary group has a suspicious, relatively suspicious death, you could say. His name was Ayatollah Mahmoud Taleghani, and Mahmoud Taleghani's last visitor was a Soviet ambassador before he had a sudden heart attack. Again, I don't know if the Soviet ambassador had a hand in the death of Taleghani. The reason why people think the Soviets might have had a hand in it is because Taleghani becomes an opponent of the idea of all-powerful supreme leader. He is against that idea. Now, if you're sitting in Moscow and you think Khomeini and this anti-American all-powerful supreme leader is the best you can hope for, maybe getting rid of Khomeini's domestic rivals is not a bad thing to invest in. But again, this is what we know in terms of Taleghani's sudden death. The last visitor to see him was a Soviet ambassador. Did the Soviets kill Taleghani? Well, maybe historians would have clarity on that later on.
Thank you. Our next question is from Sanford Weiner. How does Iran's military support of Russia in Ukraine negate any desire to reconcile with the US within Iran?
Look, the way I see Iran's decision to supply drones to Russia is a case of Iran not being able to say no to the Russians. I'm not sure if the Iranians would have, out of their own free will, chosen summer of 2022 to start sending drones to Russia for the war effort in Ukraine, because clearly, surely I should say, the Iranians would have known that the West would be extremely displeased with that, which is exactly what happened. So nuclear talks were already, stalled. And then two things that really have put us where we are today is the decision by Iran to help Russia's invasion of Ukraine militarily, and the crackdown of the protesters since September of last year. These two things really have complicated the prospects for a new nuclear deal. So I think the reason why the Iranians did it, one was, not one, there's only one. They can't say no, or Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards cannot say no to Vladimir Putin. Because look, there's no huge amount of money that Iran is making from transferring these drones to Russia. So it's a case of going back to what I showed in the presentation. Fundamentally, Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards believe that the West wants to get rid of him from power in Iran. Therefore, they have no reason to want to turn Russia down in fear of upsetting the West. If the West is upset, So be it. Apparently, that's what seems to be the case. But I have to also point out that since the transfer of the drones to Russia, there has been talk of Iran providing ballistic missiles to Russia, and that hasn't happened. I don't know if that is because the Iranians suddenly realized the level of anger this sort of military support for Russia creates in the West. Maybe that's the reason why they haven't transferred any ballistic missiles. The alternative is that the Russians are not interested in ballistic missiles right now because, again, this is another version that we have seen in open sources, that if Iran does get ballistic missiles if Iran does give ballistic missiles to Russia, then the West will provide more lethal weapons to the Ukrainians, which is not something Russia wants to see. So I don't know which of these two accounts is true, but long story short, what we know for sure is Iran's support for the Russian military war in Ukraine has complicated the process to solve the nuclear issue, which makes you wonder how important this resolving this nuclear file is for Khamenei. You would thought ordinarily that it should be the most important thing for Khamenei to focus on. The country is bleeding to death. It's losing hundreds of millions of dollars every month from not being able to sell its oil or trade freely because of the sanctions. So you would have thought they would prioritize getting the sanctions lifted, but in fact, they did the opposite. They doubled down, they supported the Russians here in a very controversial move. And I can only explain it based on what you've already heard me say. It serves Khamenei's narrow interest, but it comes at the expense of Iranian national interest.
Thank you. For the audience, we are going to end this event relatively soon. So this is the last call. If y'all have any questions, please submit those in the Zoom Q&A. And to continue on the path of foreign policy, as you said, Alex, this morning we heard that Iran and Saudi Arabia are restoring ties. Could you give us a brief background of what those ties looked like after the revolution, maybe what role Rafsanjani and/or Khamenei played in that as well?
You know, Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic, was no friend of House of Saud. So he was in the business of labeling the House of Saud all sorts of terrible names, calling them essentially Western agents and stooges of the United States and so forth. This obviously was not well received in Riyadh. So you have sort of throughout the 1980s, this tense relationship. By the time Khomeini dies and Rafsanjani takes over, there's an effort to, if you will, reset and have a new chapter start. And Rafsanjani succeeds in that with Crown Prince Abdullah at the time. They meet, they have a conversation, there is trade, increase in trade. So the other side, the Saudis did want to have relations with Tehran if Tehran was ready for it, and Rafsanjani certainly was. But here's the deal, as I described to you before, the duality of the Islamic Republic when it came to who actually decides foreign policy. So Rafsanjani's efforts towards the Saudis happened mostly in the early to mid 1990s, when Rafsanjani is the strongest against Khamenei. By the time Khamenei has sort of found his way and feels confident enough to stand up and push back against things he doesn't like, that's when I think you see Khamenei lukewarm at best. He's the one who actually kind of adopts more the Khomeini approach to the House of Saud. Khamenei is the one who's named the House of Saud, similar names to Khomeini used to do. Rafsanjani would never engage in that kind of a language. I don't want to make Rafsanjani into a saint here, by the way. He was no saint, but he was much more of a pragmatic figure in that sense, and much more interested in making compromises. Today, we are in a situation where Iran has realized that this isolation that is brought upon itself is costing it so much that it needs to find ways out. Obviously, the Arab world is an important priority for the Iranians for all sorts of reasons, from trade to security cooperation. The Iranians know that if you want to have relations in the Arab world that more or less normalizes ties, it has to go through Riyadh. There's no way around it. Your proxy groups in Iraq and Syria are not going to give you access to countries like Morocco, Jordan, and so on. So Riyadh is a pivotal player, the biggest power in the Arab world. The Iranians focus on Saudi Arabia for that reason, and that's not a wrong calculation on their part. The Saudis have decided that after their blunder in Yemen, that kind of adventure, that kind of costly foreign policy strategic mistake cannot be the norm. They need to sort of wrap that up. That's what they want to do. They want to wrap the Yemen war up. They want to get themselves out of that war. They need Iran's help since Iran has close ties with the Houthis or supports the Houthis. And on top of all this, the Saudis and the Gulf in general are not sure about US's moves vis-a-vis the Islamic Republic. And that's why China gets to play the role of the mediator, because China happens to be a country that has leverage over all these states. The United States has no leverage over Iran, but China, as Iran's biggest trading partner, has leverage over Iranian officials and can play the role of a mediator. It doesn't mean Saudi Arabia is going to give up its relations with the US and turn towards China, but it means that in the case of resolving or de-escalating with Iran, the US cannot do anything because the US has relations with Iran. China is the country that has leverage, as I said, across the board and is now bringing that forth to mediate. You know, I wish them all the best. The region needs as much this de-escalation as they can see. The Middle East is tired of the last couple of decades of war and money being spent on military equipment instead of finding ways to build up their economies, create jobs for the youth, and so forth. So anyway, that was my attempt, Sydney, at a hopeful note at the very end there.
Perfect. Yes, that is a good note to end on then. And as usual, the Iran 1400 Project does like to think about the future and think about what vision we have for Iran. So thank you for providing that. And I think that is it for the questions. Thanks again, Mr. Alex Vatanka, for being here with us today. If y'all enjoyed the event, please do check out his book, The Battle of Ayatollahs in Iran, the United States Foreign Policy and Political Rivalry since 1979. Additionally, next month, we are hosting Brenda Schaffer, who will be talking about her book, Iran is More Than Persia, Ethnic Politics in Iran. If y'all are getting emails from us, you'll get one about that as well. You can also find us online at Iran1400.org, as well as social media, Iran 1400 Project. And lastly, if you found today's event interesting, you can see an article on our website called The Quest for Power and Respect, a survey of Iranian foreign policy since 1921 by Houshmand Mirfakhrei. And additionally, if you go on our YouTube page, we've hosted several events that also cover Iranian foreign policy. So you can look in our spotlighting and author events and see those. Thank you again, Mr. Alex Vatanka, for being here with us today. And thanks to y'all in the audience for joining us.
Thank you, Sydney.